Hi, everyone. Welcome to Space Doctor. Today's topic is orbits. In terms of something going around the Earth, there are different types of Earth orbits. There's low Earth orbit, there's a medium Earth orbit, and there's high Earth orbit. And they're different. Of course, there are actually infinite numbers of different orbits that an object can take around Earth or around anything. Low Earth orbit means an orbit anything up to about 2,000 kilometers altitude. Medium Earth orbit, MEO, is generally anything from 2,000 kilometers up to geosynchronous orbit, which is just a little bit below 36,000 kilometers. Geosynchronous orbit is an orbit in which the altitude is just right so that the velocity that you need to maintain orbit takes you 24 hours to make one orbit. And that means you stay over the same spot the entire time. This is really good for things like communication satellites. So that would be the high end of the medium Earth orbits. Then there's high Earth orbit. And that would be anything beyond that. Anything, say, more than about 36,000 kilometers. Well, that would mean that the moon, which orbits just under 400,000 kilometers distant from Earth, that the moon is in a kind of high Earth orbit. So we got LEO, low Earth orbit. We got MEO, medium Earth orbit. And we got HEO, high Earth orbit. To give you an example of something that's in low Earth orbit, actually most of what we've ever launched into space is in a LEO, a low Earth orbit. The International Space Station is in LEO, low Earth orbit, and takes you about an hour and a half or so to make one orbit around Earth inside the ISS, a little bit less than that. All the early spacecraft, the Mercury missions, the Gemini missions, those were in different types of low Earth orbits. So far, only Apollo missions have taken humans beyond low Earth orbit into higher orbits, such as to go to the moon. But we're about to be doing that again soon in the Orion project, and we'll be talking about that a lot. Now, you may have heard the term Earth's orbit with a possessive, an apostrophe on there. Why would you use that? You hear journalists say this a lot when they mean Earth orbit on any type of Earth orbit, and that's always a mistake when they do that. So let's just be very clear. The only time that it's correct to use the term Earth's orbit with an S, an apostrophe S on there, is when you're talking about the orbit that is particular to Earth, meaning the orbit that Earth itself takes around the sun. That pathway that Earth takes around the sun, that is Earth's orbit around the sun. If you ever hear somebody saying, oh, this spacecraft launched into Earth's orbit, or that the International Space Station is in Earth's orbit, just know that that's wrong. And think about it, just doesn't make any sense, does it? Because there are an infinite number of orbits that anything could take around Earth. If you are in Earth's orbit, with an apostrophe, you are going around the sun in the exact same orbit as Earth. And that would include anything that's on Earth, but you wouldn't be saying you're launching into Earth's orbit because you're already in Earth's orbit before your launch, because you're on Earth that's going around the sun. Sometimes you hear this type of mistake, very often from journalists. It's this type of mistake where I think it's kind of an attempt to sound smart when you're not actually sounding smart. You're sounding like you don't know what you're talking about. There's some other examples of that come up in science. For example, since we do have DNA up on our background here, this is the Space Doctor Show. We mix biology and astronomy and space science. You'll hear sometimes people use the term genetic code incorrectly. The correct use of genetic code is it's the language that our cells and that all cells, all living things on Earth at least, and specifically units within living things called ribosomes that they use to translate between genetic information in the form of DNA and RNA and sequences of the building blocks of proteins, which are amino acids, are those building blocks, to translate the sequence of genetic material, DNA and RNA, into sequences of amino acids that give you your proteins. That's the genetic code. And there's only one genetic code on Earth, and everybody shares that genetic code. We have the same genetic code. It's not something that's unique to you. What's unique to you is your genome. So don't make that mistake. But it's, again, it's a mistake you'll hear a lot, unfortunately, from non-scientific journalism people all the time. You know, I think it'll sound smart if I, instead of saying genome, if I say your genetic code, your genetic code, your genetic code, as opposed to your sister's genetic code, or as opposed to the genetic code of a dog or a cat. Sorry, it's the same genetic code. It is the language, the translation device. Why am I bringing up in that video? Because it's the same type of error. It's an error, somebody trying to kind of vary the language for instead of using the same term over and over again, and that person ends up actually saying something that is in error. Another example where I've heard this is very typical journalists doing this, especially in the big media. Like, I'm not going to name names, but those very big, well-respected media saying things like when they mean to say vaccination, but then they'll say, well, I keep saying the word vaccination. Now I'm going to substitute a different word. And all of a sudden they'll say inoculation. Inoculation and vaccination are not the same thing. There's a very specific meaning to the term inoculation. Inoculation is when you impart some kind of entity that is able to replicate onto something that it can continue to expand, to replicate, like when you inoculate a growth medium with a culture of bacteria so that it will expand. That's inoculation. The term inoculation was connected with what we now call vaccination because the first kind of immunization was inoculation. It was called inoculation when they would give somebody samples of an infectious agent that caused smallpox before the invention of vaccination. That was called inoculation. And it is somewhat correct to say you're inoculating somebody with a live attenuated infectious agent that is used as a type of vaccination, but most of the vaccines are actually not that. And so if you hear this in terms of vaccination against SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, where the types of vaccines that we're using are mRNA vaccines, that is not inoculation, or what are called the viral vector vaccines. Even that is not inoculation. It's vaccination, but it's not inoculation. Or the Novavax vaccine, which is a kind of more traditional vaccine. It's a conjugate protein vaccine. That's not something that's going to replicate like an infectious agent. Therefore, it's not correct to call that inoculation either. So when you hear the term vaccination and you're talking or writing about it, just keep saying vaccination. Don't try to expand your terminology to kind of mix it up, thinking that it'll sound more interesting. That's an incorrect usage of the term. Just like it's incorrect to use the term Earth's orbit when you're talking about Earth orbit without the apostrophe. In general, I would say when you're not sure whether or not to use an apostrophe in science, don't use it. Because very, very typically you'll hear apostrophe S, possessive, being used when it's not supposed to be used, then you'll hear it not being used when it is supposed to be used. And boy, does that come up when we're talking about diseases. Diseases should not be given that possessive eponym. But there are a lot of respected media that are doing that because they're using guidelines, and they're using, a particular editing system where it's still allowed. Um, Even though those editing systems will never allow it when it's Down syndrome. You will offend people with Down syndrome and Down organizations if you say Downs syndrome with the possessive. But there are still plenty of news outlets, and even some of them are medical news outlets, that are still using the possessive eponym when it comes to other conditions. You'll hear it all the time with Alzheimer, even though it's really Alzheimer disease, because Alois Alzheimer did not own the condition that he defined. So it's really correct to say Alzheimer disease. But you will hear a lot of outlets saying Alzheimer's. Still, I think that will change eventually. But at least with something like the Journal of the American Medical Association, they have stopped using that. And they now point out it is Alzheimer disease without the possessive. Same thing. Parkinson disease, not Parkinson's. But I guess I'm kind of going off on a tangent. What we really wanted to talk about were the types of orbit, but let's keep this in mind. Terminology, using the wrong terminology, it can have meaning. And remember, if you're going to be orbiting Earth, you're not in Earth's orbit, except for the fact that Earth itself is in Earth's orbit. And what are the three types of orbit? Low Earth orbit, which is up to 2,000 kilometers. Medium Earth orbit, that's up to just under 36,000 kilometers. And then high Earth orbit beyond that. All right, that'll be enough for now. And we'll see you the next time.